Hello and welcome to the Securicy webinar. My name is Russell and I am the Customer Success Manager here at Securicy. We also have Daryl, our Information Security Manager here at Securicy, as well with us as a panelist. In last week's webinar, we covered how to start implementing your cybersecurity program. And today we'll go a little more in depth on that first step of the program, which is conducting a basic risk assessment. We'll have a few minutes at the end of the webinar for any questions you might have. You can type your questions into the little question section of the GoToWebinar software. In order to best understand how to implement your cybersecurity program in your organization, you need to know where to start. A risk assessment will help provide an overview of your entire organization, what assets you have, what are the risks to your company, what are the possible consequences of those risks, and how you can reduce the risks that exist. So let's get started. What is a risk assessment? A risk assessment is a systematic process of evaluating the potential risks that may be involved in a projected activity, item, or undertaking. Essentially, it's the overall process of the method where you're going to be identifying assets and risks that have the potential to cause harm, analyzing and evaluating the risks associated with that asset, and then determining appropriate ways to eliminate the risk or control the risk when it cannot be eliminated. A risk assessment is a thorough look through your company to identify those things, situations, and processes that may cause harm or impact your business. Why should you complete a risk assessment? A risk assessment will help provide an overview of your entire organization. Not only will you have to review each asset your company has, all risks that could impact those assets, but also what factors are in place to mitigate that risk. Essentially, this creates a baseline for starting your security program. It will show you the areas in your organization where you are covered, where you aren't, and allow you to move forward and start filling in the gaps in your security. So some people ask, where do we start? So the first thing you will need to do is create your risk assessment team. The team should be comprised of those in your organization familiar with computer security, technology, and the day-to-day business operations of your organization. As well, a member of senior management should be included as part of the team, somebody who has the authority to make decisions pertaining to the company. Your risk assessment team will document their findings and review them with management. This allows security to be the focus of not only the security team, but the company as a whole. Your risk assessment team should be notified when new assets are purchased by the company, so these assets can be included in the risk assessment. The team should meet at least annually to conduct a review of the findings and conduct a new risk assessment. The findings should be used each year to evaluate areas of risk and measures to mitigate that risk. Again, it's essential to incorporate those who have both an understanding of technology and your business operations. This allows you to get all aspects of your assets and the risks that could impact them. The next step would be documenting it. You'll want to be able to document your findings. For this, a spreadsheet can be used, but you could also track the information in a Word document. This would allow you to have the information in a central location. If you're more technically inclined, you can make use of formulas within a spreadsheet to help expedite the process of calculating risks. For our example today, we're going to be using a document that was created by our team and includes 3 separate sheets: a logging sheet, an asset register, and the risk assessment itself. The logging sheet will document some basic information about your company, when you were doing the risk assessment, and any kind of general comments. The asset registry is used to track all your assets in one location. And finally, the risk assessment sheet is where you will evaluate each asset and the risks associated to it. Now, let's walk through it kind of step-by-step with a few examples. So I'm just going to switch over here into our template. So before we begin, one thing we're going to want to do is establish a scope of our risk assessment. So we should identify the purpose that we're doing it. Why are we conducting this? Is it a legal reason? Is it due diligence? Is it a part of our business continuity plan or vulnerability management, or part of our incident response plan? This will help us understand the goal behind the assessment. The next thing we'll want to do is scope what assets will be involved. If we're doing this for a business continuity plan or just due diligence, we might limit this to only a certain set of assets. If we were required to do this by a third party, it might be a little more involved, covering every single asset in the company. So what we'll want to do here is put some general information in. So I've added our organization. I have our version number. We have the date that it was last updated, and then I have our comments why we're doing this. So we're doing this today for our example as part of our incident response plan and for webinar training. We have some quick definitions down below of some words we'll encounter a little later on, and we'll kind of define those as we go. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to outline all of our assets. So I'm going to jump into our asset register here. So we'll input the name of an asset. So let's just say it is our laptops that we're going to be evaluating. An asset category, we can group our assets together based on category. This is used to kind of differentiate them. So we'll put in here, say this is IT devices. Finally, any asset details. So we use here in our office MacBooks, so we'll have MacBooks, various types. The asset owner, so who owns these assets? If we were doing it for each laptop, we could put in each individual owner, but since we're kind of grouping them as IT devices, we'll put in the owner as the IT department or the company. Finally, any additional comments. So if there's any other information, we could put it in here. We'll as well touch on an AWS instance. That's say where our app is located up in the cloud. We'll say this category would be development. Asset details, so here we could say our data is in S3 storage or something like that. Finally, who owns it? So this would be our development team. Finally, any additional comments we could put in here. And the next example we'll cover for today would be cell phones. So we'll put in here, these again are going to be IT devices, various model iPhones, for example, and finally who would own these, so we can say it is again the IT department. So as we're outlining all our assets that's going to be part of this review, these can include pretty much anything depending on your scope. So this could be, again, in our example, we use laptops, it could be paper files, server infrastructure, places, people, pretty much anything. It is great if you wanted to group these together as well. So instead of putting in, say, all your different network devices, like each individual switch or firewall, you could group it together under your network as a category. So the next step here is going to be doing the actual risk assessment itself on the items that we've put in. So here I'll switch over to our next sheet. As you can see here, our asset register has kind of populated our names here over underneath our assets. Finally, we have a few different fields here that we're going to be going through. So here we're going to be rating the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our laptops. So to kind of explain these, confidentiality is a set of rules that limits access to information. Integrity is the assurance that the information is trustworthy and accurate. And the availability is a guarantee of reliable access to that information or asset by the authorized people. If a system suffers loss of confidentiality, that data has been disclosed to unauthorized individuals. The loss of integrity means that the data or the system has been modified or destroyed by an unauthorized entity. And finally, the loss of availability indicates that either the data or a system is not available when it is needed by the user. So here we're going to set our confidentiality to low. All our data is not stored on our personal laptops. It's up in the cloud, so we don't have to worry too much about that. The integrity, we're going to set this low as well. We have a password policy, and we have each of our hard drives encrypted on our laptops, so that makes sure that the integrity is very high. And finally, the availability, we're going to set that to low as well. The devices we pretty much have on us at all times is no real risk of somebody getting unauthorized access to that unless they were to directly steal it from our person. So the known threats, that could be theft, it could be a malware infection, or a virus could cause issues on our laptops. The threat value is calculated here by the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So that's calculated automatically for us. Finally, a description of that vulnerability. So what would happen if the laptop was stolen or we had a malware or a virus? We might lose access to our machine. That could cause some trouble for us as we would need a new machine, or we'd have to rebuild our laptop. So a vulnerability description would be loss of access to the device. Finally, the vulnerability value. So what is the chance of the laptop being stolen, or malware or virus infecting our laptop. We are going to set that to low. We have controls in place such as antivirus, so we'll make a note of that. We have encryption on our hard drives, and we have a secure password policy that would reduce that risk. Finally, our risk score is calculated for us here by combining our threat and our vulnerability. It totals our risk as low. Our risk, what are we going to do? We're going to accept that risk. And finally, is there any residual risk? It's very low. There's not too much else that could happen unless something very out of the norm happens. So we're just going to leave that as blank for now, or we can say the residual risk would be very low. The next example we're going to cover is our Amazon Web Services instance. So the confidentiality, all our data is up in the cloud. So that's going to be very high. Our application is built up there. We're going to want to make sure that that stays very confidential. The integrity, that would be high as well. We need to make sure that our data and the data stored there is always intact and it's not being altered by anybody who should not alter it. Finally, the availability, we're going to set that to medium. Amazon has, it's very, very reliable. They usually have about a 99% uptime. So it's a little less of a risk that it might be down, but it's still a possible occurrence. What would be the known threats? So we could have a data breach or something like a DDoS attack where our network is being flooded and we no longer have access to our Amazon Web Services instance. Our threat value because of this has been calculated and it is high. What would be the vulnerability description? That would be data loss or application unavailability. What is the vulnerability value? So that we're going to set that to medium. So maybe that could happen. We could set that to low as well. We do have a number of measures in place, such as we have alerts. Maybe we use Cloudflare to prevent DDoS attacks. As well, we could have something such as our encryption policy. Maybe we use Amazon's best practices in terms of their encryption. So we have a very secure system. However, based on the threat value and the combination of the vulnerability, our risk score is medium here. We can have a few options. We could accept that risk. We could try to reduce it, transfer it to a third party, or avoid it. So maybe we're going to try to reduce that further, and we can look into some better practices. Maybe we'll update our SDLC policy, our software development lifecycle policy, to make sure that security is in the core of our code, and we want to make sure that everything on our Amazon Web Services instance is always intact and operational. The next one here is our cell phones. So the confidentiality of our cell phones, we don't keep personal data or anything on those, so we can set that to low. Maybe the only thing that we have access to on our cell phone would be something like email, and we would have to sign in for that. The integrity, again, that might be low as well. We know the data on our cell phone, and it's a lower chance of someone getting access to it. Availability, again, low again. There's not too much of a risk here with our phones as we don't have a lot of data on it. What would be some known threats? Again, that would be something like theft or loss of a device. Maybe you lose your device. As well, there are a handful of viruses that can affect phones, so that might be a thing as well. What's our vulnerability description? We could have maybe some data loss or unauthorized access to our phone, but we can just put loss of access to the device. Finally, what's the vulnerability value? So our phones are very secure. We have a password for having our own phones and what we have to do on a portable device. So we're going to set that to low again. We know not to, have certain information. We have a password policy for our devices. Our risk score now, again, is set to low. Here we can simply accept the risk again because it's very low, and we can set here low to no risk. So as we kind of walked through that there, we did some threat identification under our known threats. We identified all relevant threats to our asset that could have potential to cause risk to these assets. We included a description of that vulnerability. There are many different types of threats, so both natural and man-made, accidental or deliberate, internal and external. And it's a great thing to kind of have those threats there and know what could affect your assets. So finally, we went through our risk evaluation where we had our risk score calculated for us. We had it set automatically to calculate based on formulas here. And finally, we have our risk treatment. So we've accepted most of the risk, and we've decided to reduce our risk for the Amazon Web Services by including some things in our software development lifecycle to make sure that security is at the core of our code. So finally, the next step that you're going to want to kind of proceed through is that risk monitoring and review. So companies are not static. They're continually changing and evolving over time. So due to this, the assets, risks, and threats and strategies outlined in your initial assessment may or may not be the same in a year's time. The values of the assets, the impacts and threats, they may change as well. So it's good to kind of monitor and identify changes in your organization as they take place, monitor new threats and risks as assets are purchased or as new risks are examined. Finally, changes in laws and regulations that may affect your risk assessment. And then finally, you should complete it again at least once a year. I wanted to thank everybody today for taking your time and joining us as we kind of walk through starting a basic risk assessment. Our webinar next week is going to be continuing our security awareness training series, and we'll cover building your security team and making security part of your company culture. I'll take a moment now to see if anybody has any questions. You can feel free to kind of post them in the little question checkbox there. Some common questions that we typically get is, well, how can we kind of review our assets? How can we consider an asset? What is their kind of that value? The best way that we consider to kind of rate an asset, or if you want to get the value of it, would be doing a cost analysis. What is the asset worth? What would be the financial impact if you were to lose that asset? Looks like that's it for questions. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. And next week, we'll be covering again in our security awareness training series, building your security team and making security part of your company culture. Thank you very much and have a great day.